Thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif, an urban planner, and you're more than welcome to join my big journey of exploring the making of smarter and more livable cities. Please don't forget to follow Urbanistica on the different social media platforms, and also let's connect on LinkedIn. Big thanks to Urbanistica podcast partner, AFRI. AFRI is an international engineering and design company providing sustainable solutions in the fields of energy, industry, and infrastructure. Are you ready for a new episode? Let's go for it. I have the pleasure to welcome Vikas Mehta to Urbanistica podcast. Hey, and welcome.
Thank you, Mustafa.
How are you doing?
I'm well. How about you?
I'm fine. So what time is it now and where are you now?
It's a little after 9:30 in the morning and I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio in the US.
Wow.
We are at the same time of New York.
Yes. So how are you doing? How is it going now in these days? You still locked down or?
Well, things are looking up, of course. You know, we are in spring now, so that helps. You can be outdoor much more. Also, a lot of people are getting their second vaccine. I got mine yesterday.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah. So in general, you know, things are looking up and hopefully we'll be able to teach, you know, next semester, at least in part in person. And since I teach classes on public space, it's particularly important. Although this was a good moment to also study public spaces with the drastic change we saw.
Yeah. How was it, the vaccine? Was it painful when you took it?
No, it's not. Some people have made a big deal out of it because, you know, and they've got back some bad reactions, but so far so good. Thanks for asking.
Yeah, nice. So when is the next one that you're gonna take?
Oh, this was my second, so I'm done.
So you're ready to go out now?
I'm ready to go, but you know, you have to still be careful, and the mask doesn't hurt.
Of course. So Vikas, you are our storyteller for this episode. How would you like to introduce yourself? And please tell us about your passion.
Yeah, so my name is Vikas Mehta, and I'm a professor of urban design at the University of Cincinnati in Ohio, in the US. And I have a background in education in architecture, urban design, as well as city planning, some from India and some from the US, where I've also practiced as an architect and urban designer. For the last 14 or so years, I've switched career and I teach urban design earlier to only architecture students, but now to both architecture and planning students. And I also coordinate the urban design certificate at the University of Cincinnati. In terms of my research, I research and write on numerous topics, including urban design pedagogy, you know, particularly public space. Urban streets are one of my big passions. Neighborhoods, retail, signage, and visual identity, and also public space in the global south and more. Of course, as many of us do, I wear several hats. With some of the other things I do, I also co-edit a journal that has been around for almost 50 years now, the Journal of Children, Youth, and Environments. And I also co-edit the newer journal, it is called Interdisciplinary Journal of Signage and Wayfinding. You know, regarding passion, I'm very, very passionate about cities and neighborhoods. You know, it's exciting that cities are alive and they are much, much more thriving today than they were perhaps, you know, maybe 30 years ago, at least in the West. And I'm particularly interested in how cities can and have the ability to create an environment to create a real social space, both in terms of bonding, that is social space for the community, but also bridging with social space for unlike groups and communities and the various publics. And in general, you know, we can go on with this, but I'm interested in sort of multiple dimensions of urbanity by exploring, you know, it as a social space, but also as an ecological setting and a sensorial art, which I think is integral to urban design.
Mm. And why you became so interested in this multidisciplinary field?
So it's a great question. It was a little bit on default because when I was studying architecture in India, we were a school of architecture under a school of environmental design. And when you're 18, you don't really follow all of this. You don't really understand what it means. But later on, I realized that the people who were teaching us were actually more than architects. We had people who were really looking at environment, and architecture was only one of the things. So I think what we learned in India was really more about cities and environments, even though we were learning about building construction and building design. So I think that somehow continued. And when I was working as an architect in the US, I found for myself that some projects, which were very exciting projects, museums and schools and campuses, somehow were not able to connect with the remaining city. And so I decided to pursue a PhD in urban design in a planning and architecture school at the University of Maryland, under the supervision of Professor Sidney Brower, who was a Kevin Lynch student.
Wow.
And so that connection was very, very inspiring to me. And so, that's from then on, I've been teaching urban design.
Yeah, that's amazing. And your journey is very inspiring. And we record this episode in collaboration with the Center for the Future of Places. And I would love to know, like, you have a really interesting journey. What is your story with the center? How does it start?
Yeah, so that's actually a very interesting story. A little bit, happenstance, a little bit serendipity. So there's two parts of the story. So on my end, and I think this is about 7-8 years ago, probably in 2014, that time I was teaching in Florida, and I received a very brief email from Sidney Brower, who was my advisor from, maybe 10 years ago. And his email was very short, and it was information about the second conference that the Center for the Future of Places was hosting. And so Sydney's email said, "Do you know about this?" That's it, with a link to that. And it might seem odd, but why it was adequate, even those, with one sentence, is because the conference title was Streets as Public Spaces. And my dissertation work under his supervision had been on streets and social behavior. How can you design and manage and plan streets so that they are places of social behavior? So it was enough for him to ask me, "Do you know about this?" So that's my end of the story. But the other end was on Peter Eminent, and Peter, who was leading the project, had somehow laid his hands on my dissertation on streets. And so we happened to essentially really just exchange emails. And I introduced myself, and he said, "Yeah, we were actually just looking at your work to invite you because this is on streets. And we are particularly interested in empirical work," which was the area of in the dissertation. So that was the conference in Argentina. Unfortunately, I was switching jobs at the time, going from Florida to Cincinnati in Ohio. So I couldn't make that conference, but I attended and presented at the next conference in Stockholm in 2015. And since then, I've been part of the center.
Wow, what a great story. Started with a very short.
Yes.
So what is your contribution to the center from that time? I know we're going to talk about your great book. So apart from the book, what are the other things that you contribute with to the center?
Yeah, so as you know, one of the goals of the center has been to really elevate important urban issues at the global level so that there is really meaningful, lasting, and measurable action and impact. And that's been really, really wonderful to see that all the resources that the center has are being used for that larger picture. And one of the key projects in there is on public space and its value to creating an equitable, resilient, and livable, city, not just in the West, but worldwide. And one of the idea that came out of these conferences was to look at all of the research that is being conducted and has been conducted and try to bring it together into a database of all the empirical kind of knowledge on public space so that it can be in one place useful for policymakers, academics, as well as people who are practitioners, and particularly in value for them who are enacting, constructing, managing public spaces worldwide. So that became a big project of which I'm a part of, and I've been part of the core research team on what we call the public space database project. And as a part of the team, we curated years of research on public space in disciplines from urban design to architecture, city planning, landscape architecture, geography, anthropology, economics, sociology, just to name a few. So we really cast a wide net because the team is very multidisciplinary. And as a part of the core team, that's been my role to first create collectively a system to organize the concepts and research on public space, because there's so many dimensions to it that we need to have a sort of a logical taxonomy, if you will, or even a typology to understand it. And that's been sort of my main work with the center for the years after 2015. And we will shortly be launching a website where all of this work has been curated and sort of presented in a way that researchers, practitioners, academics can access it and really use it. And part of that, with my interest in public space, has been the book that I'm completing that is supported by the center.
Yes, really interesting, the database. So can you just tell us briefly about this, the system? Like, how did you create it, or what is it, the system or the logic?
Right. So the system, there are six key people who have been brainstorming with another 6 or 8 researchers, doctoral students who've been really on this and focused on this for years. And we've tried to look at how we can conceptualize what we call sort of these organizing categories and key concepts. So we've got these over a dozen organizing categories and many key concepts within. And we look at every research and identify where does it fall, what are the areas it touches, and we've tried to do that. And then through that, we've been able to determine where is the research happening, on what continents to start with, which cities, what parts of cities. Are people doing research more in downtowns? Are they doing more research in neighborhoods? And then in terms of typologies, are people doing more research on streets or parks or squares or leftover space or found space? And looking at also what methods people are using. What are the outcomes of this? How useful is it to practice? So it's actually a wonderful way to sort of collectively take the knowledge of hundreds of people, into something that can be useful to practice and to policy.
Yeah, exactly. Very inspiring system, actually, and it's easy for the future researchers to just use what you collected and gathered.
That's right. Yes.
So tell me about your book, Public Space.
Yeah. So this is a project that's been going on for several years on the back burner, because it is in many ways a very ambitious project, but in many ways it has to come across as a simple takeaway about public space. So the book is tentatively titled Public Space, Why It Matters, and What We Should Know About It. And it's as straightforward as that. It's an effort to really condense the many years of work that I've been doing in editing a lot of work on public space, um, and others, scholarship from which I've learned. So it's a book that presents sort of deep learnings about public space that have been revealed by scores of authors over years and decades. And as the author, I am the interpreter, if you will, of those learnings. And sometimes I agree and sometimes I do not. And ultimately, I sort of talk to the reader about public space in my voice. And the book brings together key ideas that are encompassing social, political, and physical dimensions in how public space is made and the experience of public space. And in doing so, it casts this very wide net. It journeys a vast territory that compiles, multidisciplinary selection of learnings that recognize the traditionally sort of emerging principles that we see again and again, um, in how to conceptualize public space, how to understand it, and the making of public space. So it crosses disciplinary boundaries. It's philosophical, it's political, it's legal, it's planning, it's design and management, and looks at that and how all of that helps with the construction of public space. Just finally, a couple things about it is the main aim is to address as much as possible the complete ecology under one cover, but in a way that it is incisive and visually compelling and concise. So, and that's the hard part, because I want this book to be able to expose a student, even a professional or a scholar, to the interrelated, very, very compelling and relevant issues. But I want to do it in a very simple and easy to reach way, so that the audience is presented with the complexities, the contradictions, and the possibilities and all the potential of public space in a very concise way.
And do you like take different public spaces as a case study to do the learnings, or how do you review?
Yes, so part of it is really about how public space has been conceptualized, but I often use very simple cases to showcase. For example, there is one little example in the book about how when design interacts with public space and alters public space, what does it do to the users? And it's done with two sketches that show, a public space which was, maybe in early 2000, and it shows how and who are using it. But then it is sort of a lot of money spent, a lot of design input comes in, and suddenly it also shows now the users change and the users change. So you see how design impact can alter public space, sometimes for the better, sometimes not. So those are the ways that it uses some of the examples.
Yeah, and is it when we or when you say a public space, or is the focus like public spaces in the US, or we talk in general everywhere?
Yeah, so I think the idea is really to look at public space as a much larger concept that is aligned with the public sphere. So it is not a book about case studies. Cases are used to sort of explain certain ideas, but it's really about public space as a concept. And public space is pan-cultural. It's not something that it's a different reality in different cultures, but it is a pan-cultural reality, and it is something that connects, where people can relate to very different cultures via public space. And so it's a way that we can actually connect very, very different cultures by looking at public spaces. We can learn a lot from what public spaces, what different roles public spaces play in different cultures. The way that these ideas or viewpoints that are brought together are, again, they are part of my experiences a lot, which are in India, in Asia, as well as in the US. But there are examples from Europe, from Australia, South America, Africa, where either I've visited and made some observations, or I've collaborated with other researchers and we've done some work together as well.
Yeah. And why public space matters so much?
Yeah, so I think that's a great and deep question. But what I tell in this book is that public space, in many ways, is the mirror of the city. And if you look at public space, you can really see the achievements, the struggles, the joys and sufferings, and all the virtues and even perversions, all the cohesion and conflict, all of this gets revealed in public space. And it can actually tell us a whole lot about the city and society and the underlying structures. And in profound or mundane ways, public space affects us all. Um, there's also a sort of a clear explanation in the book about that public space is an arena to exercise citizenship, as we know, as we've seen in the recent years and decades, to express our rights and demand justice. It's a network of interconnectivity with mobility and flows to be able to connect with very, very different things and people and experiences. And it's a place to display and experience collective and shared, as well as distinct cultural identities. And that's the beauty of it. It's a place to cultivate new learning and creativity. It's a place to nurture well-being and health, as we are seeing much more. And it's a space to play and cherish leisure and respite, to sustain formal as well as informal economies. Think about all of these things. They all really occur in public space, and public space really sort of becomes the platform to enable these. And finally, it's also a site to augment our environmental resilience, which has become a bigger issue. It's a place for social cohesion, but also discord. And it's very important for us to have a space where we can agree or disagree, because the way to explore that and to resolve that is by expression, and public space provides that.
You mentioned so many important values, and now I'm thinking about like urban planners, architects, urban designers. Do you have a recipe for what makes an ideal public space?
So that's an excellent question. We have to first recognize that the ideal public space is a utopic concept, right? We think about it as this is utopic. A public space as a universal, all-inclusive, balanced arena, that would be the kind of ideal, but that is almost unattainable. And yet we should try to aim for that unachievable. We should try to aim for the utopic, even though we know that is not possible. So getting back to what is the ideal public space. So while we understand that this is utopic, we also have to agree and sort of be comfortable with the fact that there is no one public, that public space is actually public's space. There are many publics, and the many publics that are likely to share certain things and values, but they're also very likely or more likely to have conflicting interests, whether it is, different interests of people of different age or different income or different outlook. With the differences and conflicts of needs, desires, and expectations comes a whole lot of uncertainties. And thinking about the ideal public space, keeping that as the main idea here, these uncertainties with very different needs and expectations must always be seen as opportunities for civic dialogue among the many publics. And that is what makes it ideal. An ideal public space is not where everybody seems to be happy and agree. If that is what you see in a public space, you're not seeing an ideal public space. You're seeing a public space that is ideal for some. But you have to see conflict, you have to see disagreement played out in the same space, then that's ideal because it's a place for dialogue. And the this is a real interesting topic because when civic authorities and other agencies have to be very careful to assess and balance what they are regulating and what they are controlling, because all these regulations and controls after all come from us people, the residents or people of the cities. But at the same time, they can then be taken to different levels. And what the authorities and agencies who manage public space, they have to make sure that there is a sense of openness that is retained in public space. And finally, there's another way to look at it is that public space is like a fluid and it's self-leveling. Think about water and it sort of self-levels. But the role of the authorities, municipalities, managers of public space is crucial to balance that the water is leveling, but everybody is getting some of that. That the interests of the various publics, especially the less powerful, is also getting an equitable share of space and time and the kinds of things that happen in public space. So it's a balancing act. And I guess in the simplest sense, we could say that a near ideal public space is a space that is open and accessible to all the publics, but not necessarily at the same time or in the same location. So if you think about that, that's perhaps your closest possibility for an ideal.
So you don't believe that a public space should be accessible for everybody at the same time? Everybody could do an activity there at the same time, and it's during all the seasons. Like this is the perfect public space.
I do believe that that's what we should aim for. But if we don't see that and we see that there are conflicts, we kind of understand that the place that this public space is open, so that it is not by policy shunning out, and all you see is a select public happily using that public space, right? So when you see many uses that are not conforming, that are not always in sync, then you actually see that the public space is performing its purpose of being able to be malleable, where different publics are struggling to make it their own, struggling with the authorities, with others, with rules. And I think that's the place where you recognize that, yes, this public space is working.
So for you, a public space, it's fine if there are conflicts in this public space between people, authorities, policies.
Absolutely. And as hard as that might sound, that is the real role of public space. And, I find that as a researcher on public space, if I go to public space and I have a bad experience, maybe with somebody who comes and, does something or, says something to me, obviously any of us would get pretty, pissed about it. But we have to understand in the larger picture, that is happening because of other reasons, and public space is allowing that reflection. So that is actually a place where you say the public space is successful. You are not always, and you should not expect to have only wonderful experiences in public space. That is very, very curated and very selected kind of public space.
Because I will be honest with you, I did many podcast interviews about public spaces, urban design. This is my first time I hear that a person thinks that it's fine to have conflicts. There is not a perfect public space. So, which makes me feel a bit, how to say, okay, because there are a lot of pressure that, okay, what makes a perfect public space? How do we design and create? And as you mentioned, in reality, it's hard because different reasons.
Absolutely. And again, I think, it's very hard for individuals to understand that you are not going out there to have a bad experience, right? Nobody wants to do that. You might go there to demand something. You might go there to protest, and you might expect, some bad outcome out of that. But on an everyday basis, we don't go to public space to have a bad experience. We go to public space to have a good experience, whether it is being, in solitude or being together, being gathering, playing, just watching. But at the same time, I think if we see that there are these conflicts and friction, if you will, that is visible, that's actually a good sign of public space.
Mm, mm. Do you believe in the future virtual public spaces? That, that I put my VR glasses and I will meet you in a very well designed.
Great question. Well, a lot of people think, and this is a wave that has come and gone, but now it's with COVID, it's back again with us because so much happened in virtual space. So I believe that the virtual public space actually works in concert with physical public space, and we've seen that. So, in fact, the digital realm, in my opinion, has augmented the physical. And I discussed this in the book a little bit as well, that the virtual realm, through its ability of instant and perpetual connectivity, the web that it casts, the network and instant ability to connect for information sharing is expanding public sphere, if not public space, but then it plays out in public space. So, in numerous ways, it is aiding the activation, the use, and appropriation of public space. And what better example than the Occupy Wall Street movement that grew out of the power of a social media in Canada when the Canadian anti-consumerist magazine Adbusters, they first floated the original concept of Occupy Wall Street on their website and circulated it through the email list. Through that virtual sort of web that they cast, the physical space and the physical sort of use of public space or enactment was possible. Now, there's another story that Zuccotti Park is not really the public space because it is a privately owned public space. But we'll not go there. Staying with the virtual, connecting with physical, that is what enacted the movement. And its power was first emanated from the virtual. And social media has enabled and strengthened cyberspace as we see it all the time. And I think that the virtual public space has this effortless instant contact that completely has, it has transcended this whole dichotomy of local global. You can connect so easily while being on, a digital device that the local global connection is also very possible. In fact, we now experience kind of these new ways in which physical space and cyberspace they seamlessly connect. Um, and I think of it as a new typology of public sphere that is emerging, and that's delivering a very unique experience and connectedness in community and publicness. So you can connect and be at public space together at one time, and then you can disperse, and all of this can happen without a whole lot of confusion, with a whole lot of connectivity with the virtual, whether it is for some event to celebrate, whether it is for protest, whether all of the things that we're talking about, virtual space actually enhances it. So it's a great question, and I think we have to recognize that this is still developing, but they are not fighting each other. Absolutely not, as was initially thought about in the late 90s and early 2000, that we will, like, the future of work will disappear and all that. Never happened. And we are kind of again in the same throes of things. Perhaps we've got a forced experiment on us in the last year, so things may change a little bit. But staying on public space, I think there is this sort of merger between the two that is very, very beneficial to public space.
Yeah, and because what you're describing now is this relationship between the physical and the virtual. And I think this is maybe a transition toward a completely virtual public space. Do you really think that we human will be really fine with only being in a virtual public space? Or no, we still need the physical one? What do you think?
I think not. I think, we are social beings, and you might argue that, like I'm having a wonderful discussion with you right now, and it's great to have this opportunity. It would be nice to do this, in a cafe or in a bar or in a restaurant or sitting in a public space. So I think we are also, as we are social creatures, we are also spatial beings. And I think space has a lot to do with how we construct our reality of the world around us, whether it is a reality around our home or our neighborhood or our network that might be sort of very, very spatial but not contiguous. We construct spaces within the city where we know, we visit, we hang out. So I genuinely think, not that I can predict, with changes that are happening, but I think that there is a clear need that we've seen that people have expressed for physical space. There are obviously other forces that influence that. In the last 20, 30 years, maybe a little bit less perhaps, we've seen how capital in general has really, really, in what I call that capital has found public space as state gave up ownership. And capital has really, really said, we can change the nature of public space. We can make it this wonderful, sexy, spick and span space for you to come and enjoy all these experiences. And people are like, wonderful, this is great. So there are other forces that are also propping up, if you will, the physical and physical public space. But I think from a fundamental, to answer your question in a fundamental manner, we are spatial beings as well. And when we connect in space, I think there's a slightly different connection we make with each other as a species. So in that sense, I think public spaces are going to be with us, and it's the way we do things, it's the way we move around. We are not meant to be still in one place. So I think we will still keep reinventing perhaps public space, but it will be with us.
Yeah. And how can we be with public spaces? Because public spaces are facing many challenges. So how can we think in order to address these challenges?
Yeah. So again, a good segue. One of the biggest challenges I think is the way that we found, in at least in the West and certainly in North America, that when public space was essentially being left out for really lack of care, maintenance, the city was kind of generally abandoned. Um, Business and capital found public space and started to use that as a vehicle for generating more capital, more global capital. We know that, how in the big cities, but even in the smallest cities, there is always this one wonderful public space that has been created, or many, for image of that place, right? It's on their, on their websites. It'll be on
It's for
their
branding.
yeah, it's branding. It's part of that. So they use it as symbolic image public space, and they've invested in it. And I think that's a big challenge. What is deeper is that with this decades of privatized management, it has also altered the expectation of the majority of urbanites. People who are growing and sort of experiencing only these things for the most part. And what has happened is that a lot of people have started to expect the same in public space that fits the same image, very sort of middle of the middle class value and norm, where everything is clean and spick and span and wonderful, and you don't see those conflicts, or you see less of those. And so people seek the same opportunities, and like I was saying, people seek opportunities for social interaction, and we want to see people who are different from us, but they mostly see this as passive. They want to be very, very distant from these unfamiliar, in a very controlled setting, because that's what is being offered. So most people are seeking this high quality, attractive, well furnished, novel, innovative, state of the art amenities kind of public space that serves a part of this mass consumption, and it's part of the recreation. And these expectations then translate into citizens' voices that demand more of the same through community interaction, through what they say and what they want, and through votes. So that's something I find to be one of the challenges. I mean, there are many challenges to public space, but this is one of the challenges that is an underlying thing where if this is all we will know of public space, this is all we will critique, we will better, we will demand the same, and we will forget that public space has other roles to play. And it is not this neat and clean, spick and span package of place for sitting and fountain and drinking beer or coffee or, throwing a frisbee or a ball. There are other things, other roles of public space. So that's, I think to me, that is one of the biggest challenges.
Who's responsible to work with these challenges or work on these?
So, it's not only a picture of distress and doom and gloom. The nice thing is that, there are, as young people grow, they come up with, especially in their early years, in their teenage years, they're all rebellions, as we've all been. You see that they don't particularly agree with this because they are left out, right? They are shunned out. You cannot roller skate, you cannot skateboard here, you cannot do this. And when they are, then they are finding other spaces that are often left over, and they are creating new spaces there. And they are creating these liminal spaces which may be left over, but they're actually wonderful spaces, under highways or on the side of other public spaces, edges of neighborhoods, little edge of the waterfront that nobody's cared for. And I think they're finding new ways to invent public space. So if you map all of this collectively, you find that on one hand, there are these pressures of capital taking away some of the more traditional public space. But on the other hand, there is also the remaking and refinding of other public spaces in new ways. So there are other wonderful sort of opportunities that are emerging, and that's the beauty of it. That it's always this moving thing. It's always in flux for the good and the bad. And fortunately, there are both of these that exist.
Yeah, I'm actually looking forward to read your book because you have very special point of view of what public space can be. So where can we order your book and when?
So the book is being published hopefully in autumn of 2021 by Routledge, which is part of Taylor and Francis. They are a big academic publishing company, so their books will be available on the usual their website, but also on online booksellers. And I hope we will return and support brick and mortar bookstores, and they will hopefully carry it. One other thing I wanted to say about the book is that it's actually meant for not the academic, not just the scholar, not even just the student who's studying architecture or planning or urban design, but it's a book that is really for any urban citizen, anybody who's interested in cities and public space, and it's for the layperson, a member of the community who can take away a lot of things from this book. And it's written from a design planning perspective, but the book is designed as this small 5 by 8 inches or 13 centimeters by 20 centimeters journal that is something that you can easily carry. It's organized in 5 sections, but there are about 100 to 120 ideas or observations. And these are like prompts. So the book is non-sequential. You can open any page and you can find something. And it's also very visual. So you open a page and you might find a sketch or a drawing, a photograph, or a doodle that accompanies the idea and pulls you in, so that it doesn't demand you to be right away doing a PhD in public space to read this. At the same time, when it pulls you in, it is still trying to talk about some, really consequential issues about public space. So you might think of it as or at least I'm trying to create this as a little cabinet of curiosities. Small little thing you can carry and you can open and you can sort of learn something from it that can be pan cultural, that can be about the design of it, the management of it, how you can enjoy it, what you can do about it, what you can observe, all of those things.
Yeah, that's amazing. So far, there are images, diagrams. I will order. So
Yeah, and there are many good books on public space. Especially we found in the center in our research, we found in the last 20 years or so a really clear graph of exponential increase in public space research that actually tells us that public space has become much more relevant in the everyday lives of people, in their lived experiences, and that is reflected in the research. So with all these wonderful books, and I've edited 3 books on public space. I've four of my 5 books are on public space in some or the other way, and there are wonderful books. But the idea here is to create something that is unique, easily accessible, and like I said, a little cabinet of curiosities where you open a page and it pulls you in and hopefully gets you something that you did not know or did not consider, either as a layperson, an informed community member, citizen, or a student of design, planning, architecture, or even an academic about any of these issues. Hopefully, you can engage with public space.
yeah, I like how you describe it, the cabin of curiosity. I am really in love with this description. So, because I'm so happy to talk to you. Thank you so much again. And I would love that we finish this great episode with 3 questions. The first one will be you giving us, the listeners, 3 takeaway messages.
Okay, well, it's actually very nice to talk to you, Mustafa, as well, because you don't get a chance to formally talk about this all the time, and it's wonderful to also try to conceptualize the book for myself to an audience. Uh, Takeaways. So some of these might be coming from what we were talking about, but I'd say one of the takeaways is that to really engage and enjoy public space in wherever you are. And it does not have to be the public space that, as we were talking about, that the image public space of your city. Every street outside your home is a public space. And for the most part, in most places, streets are still public spaces, have that publicness that other places, in many cases, have lost. Enjoy the joys and opportunities, but also the differences and contradictions. So value the fact that public space offers you all the wonderful, fresh air, wonderful sounds, or things you see, what you can get there. You can walk in it, but also the different things that you may or may not agree, because you learn from it. There's lots to learn in there. Cherish it as a place to experience and participate, sort of the novel, the unusual, and even unexpected behaviors. Um, I think another takeaway is that, think of public space as a window to the world around you. With the way our cities are becoming so multicultural, it's actually enriching what we see in public space. It may not be exactly on our street, on our neighborhood, but it will be certainly in our city. We see so many new things and they are visible in public space. And so I guess one of my takeaways is that think of that from that lens, that the world can come to you in your public space, particularly if you live in any mid to large size city. There's so much wonderful sort of experience that is out there, and all of this is not uh, agreeable. There may be disagreements, disputes, there may be contestation, but it's also talking about different viewpoints from which we learn. So public spaces, like in many ways, they are like, it's a library, right? You go out, there are so many things that can teach you. And I don't know whether these are 3 or not, but I think that would be my one or bunch of takeaways related to public space. And then, see what you can do with it. See what stories you get from it. And in your own capacity, whether you are working around public space, whether you are a citizen, whether you're part of the community, think of how you can make the condition better, because a better public space is a better public good.
Well, Vikas, I guess people told you this before, but you're a really good storyteller. Like describing public spaces in a very beautiful way. So yeah, thank you so much for your takeaway messages. And I don't know if the last one was the question that you're supposed to ask us as a listeners.
Yeah. So how, I think maybe I will turn it around and say, ask yourself, again, we'll just stay with the idea of public space, that when you go out and experience different public spaces, what are the different things that you can get out of it? These may be very, simply they could be in the agreeable and the disagreeable. That does not mean good and bad. It actually means what can you learn from it? What did you not know? Was there something new? Was there a viewpoint that you thought was completely bizarre? And you would never agree with it, but you at least saw that. You experienced it. So my question would be to keep in mind, when you are out there, in terms of what you can learn from it, and do it consciously, because a lot of this obviously gets absorbed subconsciously, but we can, as whatever age we might be, we can learn a lot from public space. And so I'd say keep that question in mind as to what are these sort of two bins, if you will, that you can learn from.
Yeah, good questions. Good question. And here is my last question. So what will be the next step for you as a researcher?
Yeah, like I said, we all wear different hats, and also we've got these different things going that are, some are bad projects, some are terribly planned projects, others are wonderful projects. So it's not all a wonderful story, maybe for some, but not for me. There's always like a dozen things going, and some are terrible ideas, and others are, ideas that you discover are good. And
yeah.
So there's a few things, one of the big projects is tied to public space, is actually we are cataloging every public space in Cincinnati. And that's a lot, because we're looking at over 700 spaces. And we are kind of evaluating them. And the idea is that we evaluate many of them from the community's perspective. So
is it for, are you doing this for the city, for the municipality, or no, this is for the academic?
No, this is for my own research, but it's also tied to a class I teach, which I've been teaching for years on public space. So students are able to engage and learn, firsthand. But we've taken on this ambitious project to visually, on a website, be able to, for example, tell the city that this part of your city has public spaces that are perhaps more open, while this part of your city has public spaces that are really only symbolic. This part of the city has public spaces that are restorative. So I'm just giving you one example, but we want to really take this on as a large project for the whole city to try and do that. This will take years to do, but that's one of the ambitious projects. The other one is looking at children and their access to not only public space, but to nature, because there's a clear relation between development, psychological, physical, emotional, all of that for children, and intellectual development when they are exposed to nature. And Cincinnati has a wonderful park system, but we want to look at how many children actually have exposure to nature and how we can improve that. Another very ambitious project is to really try to distill the ideas about how do you create a city that is social. Can you make a city more social? And this has been work I've been interested in, but largely around streets. So this is going to be the next project that I'll start working on next year.
Well, I wish you all the good luck with all the projects, and I would love that we record an episode about the children access to the nature project when you think it's a good time to talk about it. So feel free just to email me, and we schedule a podcast meeting.
Absolutely, yeah. And I have to say one other thing before we end, because this is this really important time in terms of where we are in COVID, and we've seen a lot of press, a lot of even writing about sort of the loss of public space. And this has been one thing that I've started to observe in my own neighborhood. Then I started to look at the city and then talk to other people and started to look at other cities. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity. I'll not go into much detail, but the idea that public space that was formal, that was controlled by the agencies, authorities, capital, whatever not, had to really close public spaces for our safety. With that, we found that people started to bubble, this need for public space started to bubble up, and people started to get out into spaces, ordinary spaces, streets, parking lots, whatnot, little open space left over. And they started to claim public space and do things in it because there was nobody else to do it for them. So what you saw in a nutshell is that the agency was transferred to people. People claimed agency themselves. They started to play music. They started to establish little centers for care, to send mass food, all of that. They started to exercise. Kids started to play because there was less traffic on streets. That doesn't happen in the US. And that change of behavior, in my mind, is really an unparalleled prospect. Will not happen that often. And urban designers, planners, architects, whoever's in charge and cares about public space really needs to analyze, synthesize, and look at the prospect of this for the future of public space. And that's another project that I'm working on, is that there is this opportunity to really transfer agency from the formal sort of institutional structures to community and to ordinary people, because they can do it. And
exactly.
And as you know, people have shown that they want to do it.
Yeah.
So it's a great opportunity, and we should not let it go.
Exactly. I totally agree with you. So thank you so much again, and I'm happy to talk to you, and thank you so much for inspiring us.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. I enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much for listening to Urbanistica podcast. I hope you really enjoyed this episode. You learned something new and also got inspired by the guest. Don't forget to share the episode on your social media and recommend it to people you think they are really interested in this topic. Thank you so much again for giving your valuable time to Urbanistica podcast. I am Mustafa Sharif. Keep up the good work. Keep loving cities.